This is the last will and testament of Robert James Whitmore, dated the 14th of March of this year. And to my daughter, Claire Whitmore, nothing.
Well, I think Dad was clear about what he wanted. I think we should all respect.
I'm not finished yet.
What?
There is a second document.
The day they read the will, 17 people sat in that room. 17 people who had driven from 4 different cities, dressed in their best black clothes, carrying expressions of grief they had rehearsed in their car mirrors on the way over. And in the middle of all of them, at the far end of the long mahogany table, sat Claire. She hadn't rehearsed anything. She had driven 3 hours. She hadn't eaten. Her hands were folded in her lap and she was looking at the wall above the lawyer's head the way people look when they are trying very hard not to feel something in a room full of people watching them feel it. The lawyer's name was Mr. Gerald Holt. He was 62 years old, precise in the way that only men who have delivered bad news for decades become precise. He wore silver glasses. He cleared his throat once before he began, and twice in the middle, and the room was so quiet both times that the sound felt enormous. He read for 11 minutes. Claire's name appeared exactly once. And to my daughter, Claire Whitmore, nothing. The room went still. Then it didn't. Her stepmother, Diane, pressed her lips together in a way that looked like grief but wasn't. Her stepbrother, Marcus, exhaled slowly through his nose. Her stepsister, Renee, looked down at the table with an expression Claire would never forget for as long as she lived, not guilt, not sympathy, something that looked very close to satisfaction. Claire did not move. She did not speak. She simply looked at Mr. Gerald Holt, and Mr. Gerald Holt looked back at her over the rim of his silver glasses. And then he said 4 words that changed everything. "I'm not finished yet." To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand who Claire Whitmore was, and more importantly, who she had been to the man whose will was being read. Her father's name was Robert Whitmore. He had built his wealth the quiet way, not in a single moment of luck, but across 27 years of decisions that most people around him thought were too cautious, too slow, too unspectacular. He had started with a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of business that doesn't make headlines but makes everything else possible. Warehouses. Supply chains. The infrastructure of commerce that nobody thinks about until it stops working. By the time Claire was born, the company was worth $12 million. By the time Claire was 12, it was worth 4 times that. And by the time Claire was old enough to understand what her father actually did for a living, she had already started helping him do it. Not because he asked her to. Because she was curious. She used to sit in the back of his office on Saturday mornings. This was before Diane, before the second marriage, before everything changed, and she would do her homework at the small desk he had put in the corner specifically for her, and every so often she would look up and watch him work. Watch the way he read contracts. The way he marked pages with a red pen. The way he asked questions before he agreed to anything. Always read to the end, he told her once, when she was 9 years old. She had asked him what he meant. People hide things in the middle, he said. But they always reveal the truth at the end. Read everything to the end, Claire. Always. She never forgot that. She carried it into school, into university, into the business degree she completed at 22, into the 3 years she spent working in the operations division of her father's company before she was quietly moved aside. That was when Diane arrived. Diane came into Robert Whitmore's life when Claire was 24. She was elegant in the way that certain women are elegant when they have studied elegance carefully and practiced it long enough that it no longer looks practiced. She laughed at Robert's jokes in a way that made him feel funnier than he was. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, Marcus, who was 27, and Renee, who was 22, and she introduced them both to Robert within the first 3 months, which in hindsight said something about the speed of her intentions. Claire had tried. She had genuinely tried. She had cooked dinner for Diane twice. She had attended the engagement party with a smile she maintained for 4 hours. She had stood in the wedding photographs and kept her shoulders back and her expression warm, and later, much later, when she looked at those photographs, she marveled at how composed she looked, how completely invisible the cost of that composure had been. But Diane was patient in the way that only certain people are patient, the kind of patience that has a plan behind it. Within 1 year of the marriage, Marcus had been given a senior position in Robert's company. Within 2 years, Renee had been brought into the board. Within 3 years, Claire had been eased out of the operations role she had helped build and given a vague title that meant nothing and carried no real authority. She had said nothing. She had gone home, sat at her kitchen table, and thought about her father's words. Always read to the end. Then she had started making plans of her own. Robert Whitmore's health began to decline when Claire was 31. It was his heart, the kind of quiet deterioration that announces itself slowly, in tiredness and breathlessness and small concessions, and then suddenly all at once. Claire drove to see him every week. She sat with him. She brought him the specific brand of green tea he liked, the one with the gold foil on the box. She read to him sometimes, not books, but articles, industry reports, market analyses, things that made his eyes sharpen and his posture straighten even when his body was tired. Diane did not like this. She began scheduling things, family dinners, doctor's appointments, rest days, that fell precisely on the days Claire usually visited. When Claire called the house, the phone was often answered by whoever was home with instructions that Robert was resting. When Claire called his cell phone, Robert answered, but his voice had a careful quality to it, the voice of a man speaking in a room where other people were listening. Still, Claire came. And in those visits, the ones she managed to have, the ones where it was just the two of them, Robert Whitmore looked at his daughter with something in his eyes that she could not name then but would understand later. He was trying to tell her something. She just didn't know yet what form it would take. Robert Whitmore died on a Tuesday morning in October. Claire was not called until the afternoon. She found out via a text message from Marcus that said, "Dad passed this morning. Funeral arrangements TBD." That was the entirety of it. She sat in her car in the parking garage outside her office building and held her phone and read those 11 words for Times. And then she put the phone in her bag, walked back into the building, sat at her desk, and finished the report she had been working on. She cried later. Alone. In a way that was very quiet and very complete. 3 weeks later, she received a formal letter from Mr. Gerald Holt's office. The reading of the will would take place on a Friday. She was expected to attend. The house where the will reading took place was Robert Whitmore's home, the one he had shared with Diane for the last 9 years. It was a large house. Well furnished. The kind of house that announces wealth without shouting it. Claire arrived exactly on time. She was shown into the sitting room that had been rearranged for the occasion, the long mahogany table brought in from the dining room, chairs arranged on both sides, a carafe of water and glasses placed at intervals along the surface. Professional. Prepared. Diane was already seated at the far end, wearing black that was clearly expensive. She looked up when Claire entered and gave her a smile that lasted exactly as long as politeness required. Marcus was beside her. Renee was beside him. 3 cousins Claire barely knew sat along one side. 2 of Robert's old business associates. A family friend. An aunt. And various other relatives who had appeared, as relatives sometimes do, in the presence of a significant estate. 17 people in total. Claire sat at the opposite end of the table from Diane. She folded her hands. She waited. Mr. Gerald Holt arrived at precisely 2 o'clock. He was everything his letter had suggested, efficient, measured, betraying nothing. He placed his leather folder on the table, removed his glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth, replaced them, and opened the folder. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "This is the last will and testament of Robert James Whitmore, dated the 14th of March of this year." The room shifted, the small collective shift of people who are about to receive news they have already decided how to feel about. He began to read. The estate, it turned out, was considerable. The house went to Diane, along with a significant cash inheritance. The company shares, the majority of them, were divided between Marcus and Renee in a split that made Renee close her eyes briefly in relief. A small portion of shares went to the two business associates. Cash sums to the cousins, the aunt, the family friend. With each name, the room relaxed incrementally, like a building settling after a tremor. And then Mr. Holt reached the line with Claire's name. He read it without inflection, without hesitation, without any acknowledgement of the weight of what he was saying. And to my daughter, Claire Whitmore, nothing. The room went very still. Then Diane made a sound. It was soft, the smallest possible exhalation, the sound of someone releasing a breath they had been holding for a long time. She covered it immediately with a hand raised to her mouth, as though overcome with emotion. Marcus looked at the table. Renee looked at Claire. And Claire sat perfectly still and looked at the space above Mr. Gerald Holt's head and felt something move through her that she could not name. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even quite shock. It was older than both of those things. It was the specific feeling of a wound that was delivered so precisely, so deliberately, that the body takes a moment to register it before the pain begins. Nothing. Not a ring. Not a photograph. Not even the box of green tea in the kitchen. Nothing. Around her, the room began to breathe again. Low murmurs. The sound of papers shuffling. One of the cousins reached for the water carafe. The family friend leaned toward the aunt and whispered something that made the aunt look quickly at Claire and then away. Marcus cleared his throat. "Well," he said, with the particular tone of a man deciding to be gracious in his victory, "I think Dad was clear about what he wanted. I think we should all respect." "I'm not finished yet." The room stopped. Mr. Gerald Holt had not raised his voice. He had simply spoken, the same measured, unhurried tone he had used for the entire reading. He turned a page in his folder. Then another. And then he looked up, directly at Claire, over the rim of his silver glasses. "There is a second document," he said. The second document was not a codicil. It was not an amendment or a revision or a footnote. It was a separate trust, a legal instrument that Robert Whitmore had established 14 months before his death, quietly, privately, through a separate legal firm in a different city, and which Mr. Gerald Holt had been instructed to read in full, in this room, in front of these people, on this specific day. The trust had a name. It was called the Claire Elizabeth Whitmore Irrevocable Trust. Irrevocable. Claire felt her hands tighten slightly in her lap beneath the table. Mr. Gerald Holt began to read. "But before we hear what was in that document, before we understand what Robert Whitmore had built in secret, and why, and what it meant, we have to go back 14 months. Because the trust didn't begin with a lawyer's office. It began with a Saturday morning. 14 months before he died, Robert Whitmore had called Claire. Not from the house phone. From a number she didn't recognize, a prepaid phone she would later discover that he had purchased specifically so that calls from it would not appear on the household phone records. She had almost not answered. "It's me," he said. "Don't say my name. Just listen." She had sat down very slowly in her kitchen chair. "I don't have much time to talk right now," he said. "But I need to see you. Not at the house. Somewhere else. Can you come to the city on Thursday? The coffee shop on Meridian Street, you know the one. 11 in the morning. Dad," she said. "What's happening?" A pause. She could hear his breathing, careful, measured. The breathing of a man who had learned to be careful about what rooms heard. "Thursday," he said. "I'll explain everything." He hung up. She was at the coffee shop at 10:45. He arrived at 11 exactly, wearing a jacket she recognized and moving more slowly than she remembered. He sat down across from her and looked at her for a long moment, the look she had noticed in his eyes during their visits, the one she couldn't name. Now she could name it. It was urgency. "I don't have as much time as I thought," he said. "Medically. They've given me an estimate. I'm not going to repeat it because I don't want that number sitting in your head, but you need to know it isn't long. She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. I've made some decisions, he said. About what I'm leaving and to whom. And I need you to trust me, not because you should trust me blindly, but because I'm going to show you exactly what I've done and why, and then it will make sense. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folder on the table between them. It was thin. Maybe 12 pages. Read it, he said. All of it. To the end. She looked at him. Read it, Claire. She picked up the folder. What was in those pages would take too long to describe in full, but the essence of it was this. Robert Whitmore had known, for longer than Claire realized, what was happening in his home. He had seen it not all at once but in accumulation, the way a careful man sees things, in patterns rather than moments. The redirected phone calls. The scheduled absences. The way Claire's role in the company had eroded year by year while Marcus and Renee's authority grew. The way certain documents had been moved, certain conversations had been kept from him, certain decisions about his care in his final months had been made without his knowledge or consent. He had not been a passive observer. He had been a man working within constraints, a sick man in a house where he was being slowly managed, who had used every tool available to him. The public will, the one that left Claire nothing, was real. It was also a decoy. Because 3 years before his marriage to Diane, Robert Whitmore had made a series of decisions about the most valuable parts of his estate that had nothing to do with any will at all. Decisions about structure. About ownership. About what certain assets actually were and in whose name they legally resided. The company, for instance. The shares that Marcus and Renee had just been given, real shares, legitimate shares, were shares in the operating company. The business that ran the warehouses, the supply chains, the logistics infrastructure. But the operating company did not own the infrastructure. It leased it. The warehouses. The distribution centers. 6 properties across 3 states. The core physical assets on which the entire enterprise depended, these had been transferred, quietly and legally and completely, into a property holding company 22 years ago. Robert Whitmore had transferred them. Into Claire's name. She had been 19 years old. She had signed papers she did not fully understand. In a lawyer's office she had gone to with her father on a Saturday morning, told only that he was setting up something for her future. She had forgotten about it. He had not. The property holding company had never been mentioned in the marriage. Had never appeared in any document Diane had seen or any conversation Marcus had been part of. It was structured in a way that kept it invisible to anyone who was not looking for it specifically. And it was currently generating $4.3 million in annual lease revenue. Paid by the operating company. Paid by Marcus and Renee's new inheritance. Paid to Claire. She had put the folder down on the coffee table. She looked at her father. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to see something understood. The trust formalizes all of it, he said. Holt has been holding it for 14 months. He'll read it after the will. In front of everyone. Why in front of everyone? She asked. Her father was quiet for a moment. Because silence is what they counted on, he said. Yours and mine. I want them to understand, in the same room, at the same time, what patience actually looks like, back in that room. Mr. Gerald Holt turned to page 3 of the trust document and began to read in the same unhurried, precise tone he had used for everything else, because that was what made it devastating. There was no drama in his delivery. There didn't need to be. The trust was irrevocable. It had been established 14 months ago. It had been witnessed by 2 attorneys and a notary public in a separate city. It was airtight in the way that documents are airtight when prepared by someone who has spent 30 years watching other people try to challenge documents. As Mr. Holt read, clause by clause, asset by asset, figure by figure, Claire watched the room change. Not all at once. In stages. The first stage was confusion. The business associates exchanged a look. The cousins leaned toward each other. Even the family friend, who had no stake in any of this, straightened slightly in her chair. The second stage was comprehension. This came to different people at different speeds. The business associates arrived there first. They knew enough about the company's structure to understand quickly what the property holding company meant, and when they understood it, one of them pressed his fingers to his mouth and looked at the table. Renee arrived there next. She was sharp. She had always been sharp. It was one of the things Claire had genuinely respected about her, even when they were not on the same side. Renee's face went through 3 expressions in the space of about 4 seconds: surprise, calculation, arrival, and then she went very still. Marcus took longer. He was listening with the expression of a man waiting for the part that would make all of this irrelevant, the clause that would undo the one before it, the legal technicality that would restore the order he had just celebrated 5 minutes ago. When that clause did not come, his expression did not collapse, it simply emptied. Like a room after the furniture has been removed. And Diane had gone completely still from the moment Mr. Holt said there is a second document. She had not moved. She had not changed her expression. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and watched Mr. Holt with an attention that was different from everyone else's, the attention of someone doing rapid calculations that they cannot afford to get wrong. Mr. Holt reached the section on lease revenue. He read the figure clearly. $4.3 million per annum. The room was absolutely silent. He read the current valuation of the property assets. He read the clause confirming that the operating company, the entity Marcus and Renee had just inherited, could not relocate, could not restructure, could not reduce its lease obligations without the explicit written consent of the trust's beneficiary. Without Claire's consent. He read the final clause. He closed the folder. He looked up. "That concludes the reading," he said. "Ms. Whitmore, my office will be in touch on Monday to begin the formal transfer process. All documents are already filed." He removed his glasses, folded them carefully, placed them in his breast pocket, gathered his folder, stood, nodded once at the room in general, and left. The door closed behind him. Nobody spoke for a long time. Claire sat with her hands still folded in her lap. She was looking at the table now, not at anyone, not at anything specific. Just the table. It was Marcus who moved first. He stood up. Sat back down. Stood up again. Ran his hand through his hair. "This isn't, there has to be," he stopped. Looked at Diane. "Did you know about this?" Diane did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was careful, stripped of everything except the most necessary words. "No," she said. "I did not. There has to be a way to contest." "It's irrevocable, Marcus," Renee said quietly. She had not raised her eyes from the table. "He just said it's irrevocable. Everything can be contested." "With what grounds?" She finally looked up. And in her voice, buried under everything else, was something that sounded almost like recognition. Like someone hearing a familiar pattern for the first time from the outside. He set this up 14 months ago. 2 attorneys, a notary. In a separate city. He didn't want it found. He planned this. Marcus turned to Claire. "You knew," he said. It was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. It was the voice of a man reassembling a sequence of events and finding that all of them now mean something different than he thought. Claire looked at him for the first time since the reading began. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Because everything that needed to be said had already been said, not by her, but by a 62-year-old lawyer in silver glasses who had read a document to its end. She stood up. She gathered her coat from the back of her chair. She picked up her bag. She smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, a quiet, unhurried gesture. She looked at Diane. Diane looked back at her. 9 years of things passed between them in that look, things that had never been spoken aloud, that had lived in redirected phone calls and scheduled absences and a text message on a Tuesday afternoon that said Dad passed this morning. Claire held the look for exactly as long as she chose to. Then she turned and walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when Diane spoke. Claire. She stopped. Did not turn around. Whatever you think, Diane began. I don't think anything, Claire said. Her voice was quiet. Completely steady. My father left me everything he intended to leave me. And he left you everything he intended to leave you. She opened the door. I hope you find that the house is enough. She walked out. The property holding company generated its first quarterly distribution to the Claire Elizabeth Whitmore Irrevocable Trust 47 days after the will reading. Marcus hired a lawyer to contest the trust within 2 weeks. The lawyer, after reviewing the documents, advised him that the probability of a successful challenge was, in the lawyer's own words, not something I can recommend pursuing. Marcus pursued it anyway. 16 months later, the court agreed with the lawyer. The operating company, Marcus and Renee's Inheritance, remained exactly what it had always been. A successful business. A real inheritance. There was nothing to take from it, nothing wrong with it. It simply now operated within a reality it had always operated within, one that had been invisible until a lawyer turned a page in a quiet room. Renee called Claire 6 months after the reading. She did not apologize. She was not that kind of person, and Claire had never expected her to be. She called, instead, to ask a business question, a practical matter about a lease renewal that was coming up and that she needed Claire's authorization to address. Claire gave it. They talked for 11 minutes. Professionally. Clearly. At the end of the call, just before she hung up, Renee said, "He loved you very much, you know. You could see it if you were looking." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I was looking." She still drinks green tea. The kind with the gold foil on the box. She buys it herself now, has it delivered, a case at a time, to the office she moved into 8 months after the reading. A real office. Her name on the door, her decisions on the walls in the form of quarterly reports and lease agreements, and a framed photograph she keeps on the corner of her desk. It's a photograph of her and her father, taken on a Saturday morning when she was 9 years old. She is sitting at the small desk in the corner of his office. She is doing her homework. And he is at his own desk, red pen in hand, reading a contract. Neither of them is looking at the camera. Both of them are reading. 17 people sat in that room on the day they read the will. 17 people heard the words, "And to my daughter, Claire Whitmore, a nothing." And in the silence that followed those words, before the lawyer turned the page, every single one of them had already decided what the story was. They had decided who won. They had decided what it meant. They had done what people always do, they had stopped reading in the middle. Her father had tried to tell her, a long time ago, why that was a mistake. People hide things in the middle, he had said. But they always reveal the truth at the end. Read everything to the end, Claire. Always.